temptation in poetry is to immediately go into a discussion of form. I want to kind of invite you to think about the poem here as a density of language in which layers of meaning are present. And I want to offer you some interpretive tools for rethinking how a poem means. And we're going to look at two poems, both of the 20th century, Ezra Pound, in A Station in the Metro, and Michael Ananias' Eclogue, and think about how each of these poems builds meaning, particularly within free verse. Among modern poets, Ezra Pound always looked for certain dimensions of meaning within the poem. He pointed to four particular dimensions. In fact, the logopoeic, where the ideas within the poem are constructed within the language and how it accrues meaning. For Pound himself, this was akin to an act of translation, and so he was always, as a poet, kind of thinking about how translation, working through the mask, wearing the mask of another poet by translating that poet's work, that was a way into the logopoeic dimensions of the poem itself, to think about how language means. The second dimension is the phanopoeic. Those are the pictorial, visual elements within the poem. And with the poem, you want to kind of think about how the visual elements work together to create a larger image, how these glimpses, bits and pieces in the 20th century, through urban experience quite often, how those bits and pieces and glimpses come together to create a larger image in the reader's mind. Third here is the melopoeic, which is the poem's music. And in particular, how does the poem's music have a capacity to establish links between the visual image and the ideas that are being built within the poem? In a way, the melopoeic, if the song of the poem works, it kind of all comes together in the reader's imagination, the visual stuff and the linguistic stuff, and it kind of creates a finality to the poem where everything makes sense in a way. And then finally, the mythopoeic, which is how does the poem, perhaps through illusion or perhaps by playing with the device of illusion, create access to other worlds or to mythic spaces? How are those invoked through the poet's work? So we're going to look at a poem, an urban poem from Pound's writing from 1916 that describes a journey through the tunnels of the Paris Metro. This is In a Station of the Metro. Pound writes, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." Now, if you take the poem apart within these four dimensions that I've introduced, think about, first of all, the visual imagery that's present. You have, two different particular images that are being built here. The images of passing faces, and then you have the petals that are adhering to a tree limb after a rain. The interesting thing here is kind of the contrast to the black and the white here, the darkness and the light. How those faces become somewhat in between, though, as the poem works itself out, that the faces, become apparitions, right? They become ghost-like in a way. And this kind of invokes the mythopoeic aspects of the poem. In what way is the Paris subway itself kind of an underworld, or an undercity, or a city of the dead, perhaps? And so Pound here is playing on a sense of cities' ancient connections and cities' archaeologies, that there are layers to cities, and that those layers can be expressed in all kinds of ways, physically, historically, socially, etc. And so as Pound kind of rethinks the city as a city of the dead, how does that play into our own sense of an urban space's shifts, and a sense of the anonymity that we experience? Perhaps as you go down the steps of a subway tunnel and you've passed these other faces, how does it make you feel smaller within that urban space? The sounds of the poem, the melopic dimensions of the poem are critical here to the meaning of this all, right? First of all, the Pound wants to invoke the conversational sound of the poem. So he utilizes free verse here, as he says, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, to compose in the sequence of conversation, of human speech, versus the sequence of a metronome, as Pound says. So he works with a strong sense of rhythm, but that sense of rhythm comes through how conversation has its inherent songs within it. The song of the poem in the wet black bough, that notice how the one syllable words kind of drive home the meanings of the poem, and tries and it kind of takes the visual workings of the poem and the mythic meanings of the poem, and then brings them together to kind of provide a sense of finality or resolution to the poem, so that you end up in the logopoeic, an experience of the modern world, an experience of urbanity that's reflected through a mythical experience of the city, as well as the ways in which you see and hear the city as you descend into the underground, into the metro itself. Now, in comparison, about 100 years later, you've got Michael Anania, a Chicago poet, writing about an experience on the Chicago L, in kind of an homage to Pound's poem. And so rethink kind of how this poem invokes these four dimensions of meaning. A 1999 poem by Anania Eclogue. How sudden they seem, the gradual lives of flowers, or the faces you see in the brief light of a bee stop, taking, as you always do, the A train. If you think about the levels of meaning in Eclogue here, first the visual sense of the poem, right? You get the gradual lives of flowers, so you're immediately in kind of a deathy world, a world of of flowers passing beauty, of flowers gradual kind of flowers gradually drying up, and you also have this sense of a writer who is looking out at the passing faces, from the L's car. The writer is in the car though, right, and is going through a stop along the way. Now, one of the things that you need to know there, right, is that they're on the L. There used to be A stops and B stops, and an A train, would run express through certain stops. That the B stops were local stops, and so you could get on an A train, and you would be guaranteed that you would be only making a certain number of stops, whereas a local train would be making every stop. And so you would have this experience as you pass through a subway stop where you would look out and you would see these faces flashing by, and you might have a moment of recognition of someone you think, and then they would be gone, and you'd be back into the tunnel, or back along the elevated tracks as you go. The melopic dimensions of this poem are very important as well. Anania's poem invokes the images and sounds of Pound's poem, but in shorter lines. And here Anania is working with a sense of syncopation and jazz, as he often does within his work, and it invokes the title of the Duke Ellington song, "Take the A Train, it's the fastest way to get to Harlem." So the A Train, are you a person who takes the B train, or do you take the A Train? Are you on the express? Are you on the locals? There's kind of a jazzy mythology that's there in the syncopation of the poem. The mythopoeic worlds are that Pound invoked in his poem of Paris is also invoked here as well, right? The sense of underworld, right? That you see the faces as apparitions, that you see the faces in the passing light, of a bee stop, that you only gain a sense of a temporary, momentary glimpse of the faces. So it's not a broad experience of the city, but an experience of the city that's collected in glimpses. If you've ever ridden the L in downtown Chicago, you'll know that those moments where you turn on the track and you're suddenly looking into someone's window, and then you go on. So you have these glimpses of life as the train moves. So you have Pound's modern European city and its apparitions here against Ananias' American city and its passing faces that are glimpsed. And all this builds in Ananias' poem to recognize the divide in Pound City between light and darkness, but it also kind of wants us to think about movement and division in the American city. In what ways does social class, in what ways does race perhaps mark points of division and connection within the American urban world as we pass through spaces and recognize or imagine that we recognize faces in that passing light. So these are some other kinds of dimensions to the poem that you can think through as you continue the work in the class. I hope they're helpful. Thank you.